Welcome to this episode of Safe Home Podcast for struggling teens and their families finding their healing path. I'm Beth Syverson, a mom of an 18-year-old son, Joey, who's been dealing with addiction and serious mental health issues for several years. I'm walking beside him as he struggles with his recovery while I work on my own personal growth and healing. Today's guest is coming to us all the way from Australia. This is amazing what we can do on Zoom nowadays. Renee Knapp is a vice principal at a high school, or she would call it a deputy principal at her district high school, where she lives in southwest of Western Australia. And on top of that, she's an independent consultant with Think Effective Consultancy, where she works with schools, communities, and passionate individuals to improve mental health and well-being outcomes through a proven process and framework for change. She is the chair and co-founder of a community-based mental health action team, and she's an ambassador for the Australian and New Zealand Mental Health Association. What I love about her approach is that Renee is a big picture person. Instead of just seeing an individual behavior when a kid comes into her office, probably because they just got in trouble in class or whatever, she examines the whole life of the teen. School, family, environment, healthcare, law enforcement interaction, religious involvement, sports, and more. Renee has created a framework where the schools and community organizations and families can work together to create better mental health for our kids. And isn't that what we all are looking for? Better mental health for all of us, right? Well, welcome to Safe Home, Renee. So glad you're here to talk to me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be chatting to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I am not a big picture person. I'm a very small, detail-oriented person. So I really am amazed at how people's brains work. So I'm really impressed with the work you're doing and just kind of looking at the broader picture, because kids are only at school for a couple of hours a day, and then the whole rest of the day and the weekends, they're in the community, they're in the families, they're at home. So it's important work that you're doing.
Thank you.
So how did you get interested in mental health in the first place? Was there a personal connection or just through working with your students at school?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I guess it's been a bit of a journey for me. I'd had my own journey with mental health, and I'm surrounded by an incredible family, amazing husband, and I've got 3 boys, very supportive environment where typically you wouldn't think I should have mental health issues, but I think they'd really sat there for a long time. And I went through my own process of discovering that I had depression and figuring all of that out. And at the same time, one of my children was struggling with his mental health. I had really had issues right from early on, and through very much early on through behaviours. But by the time he was 12, I was heavily embedded with what he was going through, and a lot of early suicidal ideation and all that sort of stuff. And I guess what happened for me is because I'd not too, soon before, I had been through my journey, and I'm fairly vocal about what I go through, and I sort of talk to my kids about everything. I was able to use what I'd learnt to walk alongside him. And when that happened, at a similar time, I was at a process at school, and I'd become really passionate that we needed to start having mental health processes in school. But being in a small school setting, I was very aware that to ask our teachers to take on another committee, they were just at burnout point, and that was just never going to happen. So I met with a couple of interested people in town, one of our local doctors and a couple of other people I knew. And at the time they were talking about some mental health stuff, but I actually went and I'd become aware of a program called Mind Matters and Kids Matters at the time. It's now changed in Australia and is known as the BU National Initiative. But at the time when it was Mind Matters, I've probably got to start. There was a lot going on at the time, and I was a chair at the time for a behaviour program at the school. And what I realised is that being at a small school and being in a rural setting, I didn't want to make a change happen with behaviour and mental health and just have it come and go, have it there for a year, disappears, nothing ever changes. And so as I started exploring mental health options for a school, I discovered this Mind Matters approach, but I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if instead of just looking at the school setting, we were able to look beyond the school walls? Because as you highlighted at the start, so much goes on for our kids that happens outside of the school walls. And I guess as a deputy, what I discovered in my role with students is that we would often get stuck. We could do lots of things, but a lot of what was happening for them, particularly high school kids, was out in their community. It was family-based. They weren't able to access support. They'd been involved with the law enforcement, whatever it might be. So I approached Mind Matters and I sort of said to them, look, I'd like to develop this process for a community approach and actually look at how we can work to improve mental health, but do it in a community setting. And at the time, they were really excited about that and they were interested to see it evolve because nothing like this had happened. And so what basically happened is I got these interested group of people together. It was only 4 of us at the time. But what was really significant was that the doctor was involved. And never before in my career have I, as an educator, been able to work alongside health professionals. You know, we refer kids off, we do that sort of stuff, but we never get to actually talk to doctors and say, look, it'd be great if you could, when you see kids, you know, you're aware of this and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, set this team up. And basically at the time I founded what we now call affectionately our Community Mental Health Action Team, or COMHAT. And what has developed is, as I've evolved this process, and we're now at a point where we've now got 4 or 5 paid people that are working. I'm rolling this model out to different places across Western Australia and, in my opinion, the country and the world, because I just think it has been groundbreaking what's developed because, as I said, what's really happened is a process that's engaged our sporting clubs, the law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what that's meant is that we're getting to make change happen for our kids in mental health that they wouldn't normally be able to access, you know. So that's kind of where I came from with it. But I was then able to take that back to the school and really look at, well, if we're looking at this multi-pronged approach in a community, this is what we need in a school setting. So I used that to develop a student engagement plan, because what we were finding is that kids would come in with behaviour issues and there was so much more to consider. You know, so much more going on. So, I really think, like I said, that's a long-winded explanation of where it came from, but there's been so many different things going on, and I guess what I did was try to pull it all together and figure out where to go.
Yeah, that's where you are key. You're sort of synergizing all of this together. And those behaviors that are so annoying or frustrating or intractable sometimes, that's usually just the tip of the iceberg, is it not?
Absolutely.
The behavior that pokes itself up, there's usually a bunch of stuff underneath there. So the behavior isn't really the problem.
No.
It feels like a problem when you're a teacher and there's behavior happening. But the problem usually is much deeper and much harder to fix, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that is actually the key, and I think that's what's coming out through schools. So with the work that I do with schools, initially a lot of schools wanted support looking at their behaviour programs. But what I have really tried to move schools towards thinking is that, because there was a big push in Western Australia, we had a lot of money go towards mental health programs. But what really happened was that schools didn't know what to do with it. They knew that they needed to improve mental health, but they didn't know, one, how to link that to behaviour and how to make those changes happen. So what I've basically been involved with, and what I try to help schools do, is that behaviour is often sat separately, very separately to mental health. But without a doubt, as you've pointed out, they do not exist separately. Behaviour is often the first sign that something's going on. And while it's not always directly linked to mental health, there can be lots of other reasons going on. I think what's really important is that we have to approach it and go, what's actually going on? And I think people sometimes get caught up with that. That's an excuse for not dealing with behaviour. And I think in no way possible is it that behaviour doesn't have consequences and things. But what has to happen is, when we see a behaviour going on, so the process I tend to follow is that when we see a behaviour going on, we go, okay, let's identify what's going on for the kids in terms of what we're seeing, but let's also find out academically what's happening for them. Let's find out, are they accessing at the moment any mental health services? Are they currently having any engagement with law enforcement? What is their, and this is key for me, is what is their sense of belonging and connection? Are they engaged with any local sporting groups? Are they very isolated? What might it be that's going on? Because once we can take all of that, we can then find something that's actually going to be beneficial. Because I think the problem with purely looking at behaviour is that sometimes we might address one part of it, but it will just come back because the other things haven't been addressed.
Right.
And I think the thing for schools is that they know, I think they're getting to a point of realising that this needs to happen, but they just don't know where to start and how to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I've tried to do is to, as I've gone both in my journey with schools and with communities, I've documented from start to finish, how do you actually bring people together? How do you make sure that the chaplain at school or the psychologist at school or the admin at school or the teachers at school are all part of the process, and the student and the family, first and foremost, I should say. How do we make sure that all happens so that schools don't get caught up in the logistics of it? Because that's where I think it falls apart. So,
yeah, you want to remove any obstacles that you possibly can. So when there's a kid presenting with a serious issue or something that could potentially become serious, you want to get that acted on as soon as possible, right? So
absolutely.
You have found ways to clear the way ahead of that. What are some of the common mental health deficits or problems you're seeing at your school? What are kids coming to you with?
Look, I think they're at a peak at the moment. I was literally talking to our school psychologist only a day ago, and she's at breaking point. The system's at breaking point trying to support mental health. I think very much the issues that come about are, I think in primary school there's a clear indication of anxiety, but I think the thing is that quickly in a high school setting can lead more around depression. And I don't claim to be a psychologist. I think it's really important to acknowledge that I have a very key intervention role, prevention role, all these sorts of things, but it's not, I just want to make that clear that I'm not technically a counsellor. I've done lots of mental health training and things like that. But I think what's clear as an educator who sits and sees a lot of what is going on, I think that, and I hate to fly this banner because it comes up a lot, but I think that social media and internet has clearly had a role to play. I think that educating, and this crosses over into my community setting, what we've found is that in a rural setting, access to services is really difficult. And so problems that have started early and could have been addressed often get to a much more serious point where we have to look at suicidal issues and things. And parent, it's really hard to hear that your child's having thoughts around suicide. And I mean, it's just devastating. And I think that it's important that, and this is where I think the community side of things comes in, is that we've got to be able to have, like, the poor mental health system is really working as hard as they can. Their little duck feet are going and they're trying to do everything they can. But one of the things that we've done in our community setting is we've built up the training of youth mental health first aid amongst anybody who wants to get access to that. So we identified that one of the issues was people knew to ask, "Are you okay?" but had no idea what to do after that conversation.
What do you do if they say, "No, I'm really not okay"?
Which is a common thing, and I think when we've looked at, and I certainly, because obviously with my community role, we've looked at youth, but we've also looked beyond, and certainly with the guys in our community, they're like, "Oh, okay, here's a beer," once someone says they're not okay. So I think that part of our role is to empower our young kids to know how to support their friends and how to, stepping over the line and actually saying, "I'm struggling," whether it's a kid talking to their mum, whether it's a kid talking to their friend, whether it's an adult talking to anyone. It's really hard. I know that when I first sought help for depression, it took me 4 goes, and I'm the most spoken person, like I often get told that I need to have lollies at staff meetings to keep me a little bit quiet. But it's really hard to admit that you're struggling. And I think we find that as adults. And so our kids, even the ones that are the closest to their parents, it's that idea of admitting that they can't figure this problem out on them. And so I think that this whole idea of this wraparound approach is essential, because I think programs are amazing. But if all we're applying at a school is a social emotional program, which is a wonderful piece of the puzzle, but if that's all we're doing, or all we're doing is offering counselling, say, then we've missed this wealth of things that we need to do. So I think that we've got to get our schools better. We've got to get our communities better at being able to have this approach. But I think the issue comes, and this is where I step in, is that it's how to negotiate that idea of having that support. So in a school setting, I really advocate for a culture of wellbeing, because while you can have a program to support a kid or an intervention when they're suicidal or a support process when their behaviour is not good, if we don't have a process that addresses how the teachers are talking about respectfulness and resilience and those sorts of, the language that's involved, and if we don't have a process for how a kid gets from a behavioural issue to the student services point, if we don't have a plan for how we communicate education to our parents and our school community, then I just think we only get a little tip of the iceberg, and we never get to make a dent on these horrific mental health statistics, and start saving people's lives, sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, our experience at Joey's high school, the school nurse was instrumental in getting him the help he needed. So he had tried to kill himself the night before. He went to school and told his friend, who I'm ever grateful for hauling him to the school nurse. So that piece of it worked really well. She called, sent him to the ER right away, and we went from there. Then after Joey got released from the psych hospital, it was probably 2 or 3 weeks later, I went back to that school and said, listen, your teachers and your students are toxic to my son. He tried to kill himself partly because of all the bullying he's received from everybody at your school. Well, he was not too amenable to that. He did not really want to hear that at all. And he, in fact, blamed my son for not having a thick enough skin.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
So it was horrible. And it's just indicative of that kind of, just buck up. You can do it. Just whatever. Don't let it roll off your back. Well, it didn't roll off his back so much so that he tried to kill himself. Can we wake up to this a little bit, please? I don't think he will ever change. But I did go up to the superintendent's office and talk to someone, and he said he incorporated some new whatever, blah, blah, blah programs. But it does seem like you're kind of reliant on these, the leadership, their attitude toward mental health. And if they aren't keyed into how critically important it is, it's kind of tricky to navigate, yeah?
Oh, do you know, I think that's exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yes.
Is because I think that there are lots of very well-meaning people like the school nurse that you were lucky enough to have. And I think schools are at one of two places. I think, and I do feel for our educators, because they came, for the majority of teachers and educators, they've had zero mental health training. They're getting it now, but they didn't come through university with that. And that's a challenge of the education system. But I think some schools are open and not afraid to say that sometimes we don't do things perfectly, and they're wanting to move and they're wanting to change. And some schools are just purely on the defence. And sadly, that's really detrimental if your child comes up against that. And look, I very much tell people that you're never going to find a perfect school. There are going to be things that go wrong. But what you need from a school is you need good communication. You need to be heard when you've got a concern, and you're the only advocate for your child as a parent. And granted, sometimes as parents we get passionate and we might get, but that's understandable. And what's important is that a school hears what's going on and works towards improving it. It might not be perfect now, but I think the problem exists that the schools sometimes don't know what those steps are. And so sometimes, and I think there's many schools getting better at this, but I think sometimes, unfortunately, they want to appear to be doing the right things, but really they're just putting a Band-Aid on and not really addressing the issues. And so that's, I guess, why I've become very passionate about getting this process out, is that I just want to see it done better. I think our educators, as an educator, can be amazing, but I think that schools need guidance to be able to make this process happen.
Yeah. It's big, dealing with people's mental health. It's like, like you said, teachers didn't go to school for that. They went to school to teach whatever subject area, but you can't teach if their mental health is broken. It's kind of over everything. then the mental health of the teachers and the administrators too, by the way, right?
Oh, well, absolutely.
It's not just the students. The teachers have been so stressed out with the COVID and everything. Oh my God.
Oh, no, it's been very stressed out. And I think that you're right that, you've got to have a plan in place, because if you don't address those things, then your teaching side of it, it's a little bit like if you don't have good classroom management or good behaviour skills, you're never going to get the curriculum taught.
Yeah.
So
you can be the best teacher in the world, but if you can't manage the class and be able to teach it, then
absolutely.
Can you give us an example of what it would look like, a practical piece that could help us visualize this kind of communication between all these different systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we've developed ComHat and the sort of the model of what I've done is that it's really important to have a lot of people rush. Like we've had in Australia, we've had a lot of bushfire incidences. And, this trickles down to the kids and what they're experiencing.
Sure.
There's been floods. Look, every country in the world has issues. But what's important is really, and this is where I think gets missed, is that people are very quick to go, we're in a crisis, we need to address things, which naturally you've got to rush with things. And this is a little bit like kids' mental health. We're experiencing lots of suicide, something's happened and we need to address this. So I think what's really important is the piece of the puzzle before the actual action. And what that means is that bringing those people together is really key. So in a community setting, before we even get started, it's about approaching the right people. Okay, and this is why I include the words in my bio at the start about passionate individuals. I think often the drive comes from someone, possibly people like your listeners, who are passionate about seeing change happen, but not know where to start. And then it's about going, okay, I've got this model. Like I said, this is a model I can share with lots of people. And I go, I need to talk to my doctors, I need to talk to my law enforcement, whatever it might be. Now, what we did was we started with just a small group of 3 or 4 people, just anyone who's passionate, because to jump in and ask and invite people is very tricky. And then what we did was set up, okay, before we could get to any of the issues, we'd identified as 4 individuals that there was a lack of support services and that there was a real lack of belonging and connection in our community, which affected our youth, which affected our older generation. There was none of that coming together of old that we used to do. But before we could do any of that, we went, we need to all be sitting on the same page and understanding about mental health. So the very first step was to go, okay, what do we believe as 4 people that mental health entails? And we sort of talked about that. But then what we did was to push that awareness out and start to develop a presence in our community. So for probably a good year, we really started getting the conversation around mental health happening. And we then talked to the school. So I, as the school representative, went back to the school and went, okay, so what do the students think mental health is? What do the staff think mental health is? What do the admin think mental health is? What do the parents think mental health is? And what happened in our setting was this wave of enthusiasm and interest in what we were talking about happen, which actually led us to getting about $25,000 donated to our group to be able to employ someone to then run what we were trying to administer. So to be able to, do some more data collection, start investigating support services. The key thing that I hear a lot is that to make change happen in a community, a shire is very critical to that. And often it's where a lot of places get stuck. And it's a little bit like you go back to your situation in the school. If the admin's not on board, that's where things get stuck. And so if you take this community model and let's say go back to a school setting and think about all the different pieces of the puzzle, if you've got someone passionate in a school, say it's a parent or say it's a teacher, doesn't really matter what it is, or an admin, and they're thinking a little bit like I was, we need change to happen, but how do I make this happen? So say, for example, they talk to someone like myself and get this, like I've got a checklist that people can use about all the steps from woe to go to what to do. And they take this thing to their people and maybe go, is anyone else interested? Like if it's parents, it might be anyone else on the parental group.
PTA or
the PTA or something like that. Or if it's a staff member, it might be a few other people or whatever it might be. And we go, okay, what have we currently got going on at our school that's good? Because I think what's really important, and sorry, I tend to go here, there and everywhere when I'm talking about these things, but I think what's really important is bringing people along on the journey. I think sometimes what happens is when things have gone wrong, we come in very upset, understandably, And then people get on the defensive, whether it's the school or whether it's the school talking to parents about their child and they get defensive, whichever way it might be. Mm-hmm. So we have to be conscious that mental health is a sensitive topic, mm-hmm. and not everyone in that situation is going to come to mental health with the same understanding. Some will have experiences, some will have prejudices, and so everyone will come at a different angle. So it's about bringing people along on the journey and going, okay, I'm not going to judge where you've come from, but let's get a snapshot of where everyone sits in mental health. Yeah. What is it that your understanding is of it? And then let's go, okay, so let's now take some passionate people. All right, our school psychologists, and sorry to jump back again, but what's important in a school setting is that it's not just the teachers, the parents and the kids. It's the school officers. It's the counsellor. Because you think about, as a parent and a kid, they see the school officer probably more, they're the ones answering the phone. They're the ones sending you to the right person. So they have to have an understanding of how to, have this language going on and all those sorts of things. So this is why I come back to this idea of a cultural change, because while we can implement one thing, we need to bring those different people. So if we start from that mental health awareness place, we can then start going, all right, we've got this snapshot, we've got a little bit of data. How can we bring in some key people? So we really have to have someone on that admin. Now, maybe the principal's not supportive, but maybe one of the deputies is, or maybe one of the, the leader type teachers is, or whatever it might be, because I think I think people have to be aware that you may not always have the right people that you might ideally want. We're not going to have an ideal situation. Right. But if you look at the situation, you might be able to find someone who's got a similar passion sort of thing. So I think that that's really important. So, I think about maybe your listeners and it might be that they're going, I really want this to happen, but I'm just a parent. And I say that very lightly, I'm just a parent, because it's a massively important thing. But what I mean is that they might feel that way, but really everyone has the power to make change happen. But it's knowing how to go through that in a school setting, how to intervene without just becoming like the annoying parent who's going, well, you need to do this and whatever it might be.
I'm sure I came across like that.
Oh, but it's understandable.
But my passion was, oh my God, something has to change. I almost lost my son.
Oh, exactly.
And all I needed him to say was, oh my gosh, I am so sorry. Not sorry like as apologizing for the school, but I'm so sorry you went through that. That must have been so hard. How can the school support you? What can we do? Or what,
exactly,
what did your son need? Instead, he threw it back at me, but maybe he could have thought about putting himself in my shoes for just a moment.
That's exactly right.
Come on.
Your statement is exactly right. And I think that's exactly right. When you're expressing something like that, you don't necessarily need someone to have the answer right there and then. You just want them to acknowledge, wow, that is, that's really difficult what you've been through. We need to sit down and figure something out around this. As would it be that if a kid came to their parents or someone and said, I'm not coping, and instead of us trying to fix it, which we tend to want to do, they'd be able to go, you know what, this must be really hard for you. Let's figure it out together, and I'm going to walk beside you. And I think that that's exactly right, Beth, and that's the model you want. Schools don't have to have it perfect, but when they get defensive, that's what happens. But if schools just need, and I think people like you are exactly the person that, for me, that I'm looking to work with, because when someone's passionate, that passion can be turned into something productive. And I think often people think, I'm passionate, but I don't have any knowledge or experience. But I think that's the starting point. There's lots of other people that can bring that knowledge and assistance in, but it's the passion that drives the change.
Oh, if that vice principal would have said, help us create something, I would have been so on board,
totally
especially
different.
At that moment in time. I was ready to throw everything out of my life except for whatever I can do to help my kid. I would have started a parent committee. I would have volunteered. I would have done anything, but I didn't know what to do.
They would have had a parent for life.
Yes, he missed out. I'm telling you.
Very much so.
But man, if you can find those key people in each of those sectors, put their heads together, and I'm sure it's different for every locality, right? You can't
very
just
much
say,
so.
do this and this and this and it's this. It depends on what's happening in each particular town or district, right?
Well, I think you're right. I think very much every setting's different. But what I think is that instead of having a program to follow, if you have a framework of change to follow that says, step one, this is how you develop your team. Step two, this is how you collect data. I mean, I used to freak out hearing collect data, but it's actually more productive than that. This is how you start to make initial changes happen. Then that model can be the same in every school and every setting, whether it's in WA in Australia or in America or in Iceland or wherever it might be. But what the difference is that you can then put in the things that are relevant to your group. Say, for example, in your setting, these are the issues, this is the problem, these are the people we've got on board, blah, 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 blah. That can work within that framework model. But what it also allows people to do is that in the one school, while right now the issue might be kids having suicidal ideations or whatever it might be, but then a year or two later we might have a bushfire. And but this framework should still work with supporting people through that process. Or while right now we've got an issue around kids having respect and that's becoming an issue and things like that. A couple of years later, we're having an issue around we discovered one recently with behaviour around homework, and the problem wasn't homework. The problem was that parents didn't understand how to support their child with the things that happen when you're in a high school in terms of studying. The kids didn't have the skills. The teachers were not using consistent language, and this was having an effect on all sorts of things, ripple effect and mental health and blah, 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 blah.
I'm sure.
But what it means is that instead of having a program that you implement and it changes, which will come and go, you have a framework and then you can bring in, so say, for example, right now we're really worried about the resilience of our kids. They're not coping when things go wrong. We've really noticed a pattern. So, okay, great. We don't have to be the experts. We as teachers need to be able to teach lessons around that and intervene and refer kids to the services. But we're going to bring in this program, this great resilience program at the moment, which, as I said earlier, is one piece of the puzzle that comes in. It's wrapped around by student services. It's wrapped around by the language the school is using. It's wrapped around by everything else. But then, okay, we've done a really good job of addressing that. Let's move on to this. But you don't have to rejig the whole system. You've got that backbone and you modify it slightly to tweak what's going on and what the needs are of the kids in the school.
Very good. I think that's amazing. That sounds like a really smart way to do it. In your school, in your area, is suicide, are kids killing themselves? Are they having a lot of suicidal ideation? How big of a problem is that right now?
I've got a presentation I did recently and I actually put some of those statistics up. And just recently, suicide, this is Beyond Blue. There's an association called Beyond Blue, which is one of our big mental health associations. And they said that suicide is still currently the leading cause of death in young Australians. It's just quite horrific. And when you actually show staff some of the statistics, it's just, and I think COVID's increased the without a doubt.
Yeah, made everything worse.
But I think there's a really scary time that while kids are at school and things go wrong at school, but there's this watchful eye, there's these teachers, the parents, but that 16 to 25-year-old gap where kids might not have anyone, like they might have parents monitoring them, but suddenly it's one prong instead of many prongs. Or they might not have anyone, and I mean, I think there's other ages as well, but just talking about youth at the moment, I think that's a really delicate, sensitive age because those support systems aren't naturally there. We have a something called CAMS in WA, which is Child and Mental Health Adolescent Services. And if a child's really at the peak of issues, we refer them onto there. And I know that there's been a drive to try and have something similar in an adult model because I think what we've addressed in a community setting is that as a society in general, we're really good at the low-level mental health. We're really good at, we've got a system. We're good when someone reaches crisis, but it's the lead up to crisis that's so critical because we don't want kids to get to crisis. We don't want people to get to the point where they're, like your son was. And, we want to be able to intervene before that. And so I think that that's very much where the work is occurring in Australia is trying to figure out, and that's where I think I sit. Someone asked me the other day with my Australian and New Zealand Mental Health Association role, they wanted me to write an article about how to support mental health peer workers and the mental health professionals. And I said to the person, I said, I would love to write an article, but I don't think I'm the right person to write that one, because my role is to bring those people together and but we've got to respect that every zone, every sector brings a wealth of strengths. I think that if we as educators were to say, we know everything about the mental health profession and we know, it's disrespectful to what every piece of the puzzle brings. But what's interesting, certainly in my role as the community mental health person, we had an incident. So we have a board that sits of about 6 people where we look at the big picture, and then we've written a community wellbeing plan, and we then have an action team that includes any group that wants to be part of it. So our local cops are on that, our Primary Health Alliance out from like people from up in Perth, our drug and alcohol education people from Perth have come. We've got sporting groups, And we had a meeting one time, and we always sit, because I facilitate the meetings, and we go around and first of all identify what's going on for the groups and how we can support that. And then we talk about things that we're pushing through the plan and how they can support driving those initiatives. And one of our sergeants at the time, a previous sergeant that we'd had, said, do you know what, we're currently just 80% of our job at the moment is mental health. And they said, and we're not trained in that. We're law enforcement and we're there to support that side of things, but we're really struggling and we just don't know what to do. And we're finding a lot of people that were suicidal. And so one of our other people on the team was a suicide and education prevention officer from our local Southwest region. And we said, right, we're going to get you in contact with her, because there is lots of things we could do. Because one of the issues he was having is that they can have a team where the police can access a group, like a support network, and they come out and be there when they do it. Yeah. Being in Boyup Brook, a few hours away from these services, it never works. So we went, right, how can we problem solve this and make something happen so that our fantastic sergeant who's addressed an issue can start to get some results? Because I think, what we were finding, and I think this applies to schools and communities, is that I got interviewed on a radio and asked, there was a huge influx of money that was coming in from our government, which was wonderful, for mental health. And they said, what should be happening? And I said, you know what, it's the government's role to provide that money, but it's our role on the ground to figure out how to utilise that to make change happen in mental health. And so I think that by having this framework for change, you can actually write plans up. So I alluded to the fact that we had a community wellbeing plan. Well, I've done the same in a school setting and written this culture wellbeing plan, because once you've got a plan, you can then go, right, let's get some funding. So we just recently got over $200,000 funding for our community to make to purely focused on youth. So purely focused on what we could do for youth in the mental health area. And that was because we'd come together in a proactive way. We'd written a plan that had engaged the different groups, and then we'd been able to take that to the funding, to grant opportunities. So same with a school setting, you have that structure and you have that cohesive team and action. You can start looking at getting some true support happening for the kid.
So you can use that money for more school psychologists or more counselors?
So what this money specifically is addressing, so we're providing a youth officer, we're able to provide a dedicated time and have a youth zone so that kids from the school, so we then go to the school because of my link and go, right, we want to run that youth zone so that the kids can come. So we're getting the kids from the school to come and paint and be part of the process.
After school program kind of thing.
So it creates this beautiful relationship between the school and the things that are being offered. So we're currently offering youth Zumba, which, even though that sounds crazy, it's part of our belonging and connection program. But the school have offered their hall, so we don't have to pay for it, which is this lovely relationship that we have going on with the school that allows us to provide belonging and connection opportunities for the kids. So,
and that's so important. That belonging and connection piece, that is the cure.
It absolutely is. I think it's a cure for so many things, and it looks different for everyone. I use the example of my husband, who's very shy, would think of nothing worse than talking to someone on a podcast. But he needs belonging and connection the same as I do. But mine looks very different. I need to see people. I need that. I need that connection with people. He doesn't need that, but he still needs belonging and connection, and it looks like this. Or, and I think of kids at school, and we've had some kids that have had serious gaming addictions.
Oh, yeah, that's a big problem.
When you actually picked it apart and you work with a school psychologist, you work with the parents and you work with the student and you work with all the different people in the prong, all these different areas, what came out was that it wasn't a homework issue. It wasn't a gaming issue. It was the fact that he wanted to belong. And he got that belonging through his gaming.
For sure. Yeah. Anything you're addicted to, you're looking for something to fill a need, right?
Absolutely.
It's like a coping skill. So these kids are getting communication with their friends. They're having fun. They're succeeding or not with the game, but just that community, that togetherness and shared interests and things like that. And unfortunately, then you get the sexual predators coming in there and helping them out.
I'm so glad. I'm not glad you said that about sexual predators, but what I think it highlights is that, say, your culture of wellbeing, you can't have just behaviour and mental health. You've got to think about what's the education for the kids around protective behaviours and that side of things. What's the education for the kids around, and not just education, but what's the education for the parents? If you take digital safety, what's the school got in place that educates parents and kids? What's the school got in place that addresses internet usage and phone usage at school and things like that? We've just had a big thing in WA schools that, kids can't have devices at school and things like that.
Oh, really? So you took them out of your schools completely?
Yeah.
God, I wish we would do that.
They're allowed to have them until they reach at school, but they can't be accessed at all. But what's significant is that, like, our school has pretty strict rules about it, because it's not about the kids' use, it's about the teachers' behaviour. It's about whether they consistently, enforce those rules. It's whether, is everybody saying that needs to be put back? If that's not consistent, and this is what I mean in terms of, if we take behaviour separately, if we take mental health separately, if we take IT separately, if we take health ed separately, we're missing an opportunity, because all those things come into play. You talk about addiction and things. Well, that's a huge part of the health curriculum. Yeah. But if that doesn't link to mental health and behaviour, that just, for me, seems crazy. But like I said, I keep harping on about it, but it's the making of that connection happen is what I think that schools and communities struggle with, because we know we want it to happen, but how to make it happen, and that's where I sit, is that how to make that happen, because I just think it's critical. I think it's what is missing from the education system and society and communities. So,
and you're the key to that you have the answer to the how. And how would people get a hold of you if they wanted to talk to you about working with their community or their school?
Absolutely. Look, I've got a website, and if you Google Think Effective Consultancy, my website's thinkeffective.com.au. I've got a dedicated page. There's a section called Work With Me, and I've got a dedicated page for community approaches and also for school approaches. So depending on where people feel passionately about making change happen, they can see for that. If people want to be more connected, I'm certainly, same thing, Think Effective Consultancy on all the socials, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. But if people want to subscribe and keep up, what I've tried to do, I've been writing a blog that anyone can access for free, both through community and school. And what I'm doing is trying to write everything that's in my head. I'm trying to write down step by step so that people can go, step one, this is what Renee did. Step two, this is what Renee did. So I've written it out, and then what I've done is I've actually created a checklist that matches the way I'm doing the blog. And if people wish to, they're welcome to subscribe to my newsletter to keep up to date with those blogs, but they'll actually get a copy of that checklist, and they're welcome to take that. You can take it to schools, show anybody you want. Nice. And I've just recently added a video for both community and the school one, where I talk through the why you should do it this way, the what parts are included, some key things you can start. So basically, if someone wants to do this straight away, they can do it from themselves as a do-it-yourself process, but they can also go, I've got this and I want to take this to my school and show them, or I want to take it to some other passionate people and go, just watch this video or just look at these things. Oh, that could be something we could do, So that would be where I'd say to go.
Yeah. Well, all right, you teachers and parents and healthcare providers and therapists, and come on board and get on this big picture wagon so we can help our kids. That sounds really powerful.
I'd love to help anyone who's passionate about doing it. I'd just love to help make more of this happen and see more success.
And just to be clear, you can work internationally, right?
I can, yes.
Yay. Yeah. Good. Okay. And it's all the same stuff you're dealing with. US, Australia,
very much
wherever.
So. And I have an affinity over there because my brother's married to a Canadian. So my gorgeous nieces are over in Canada. So I haven't seen them during COVID. It's been torture.
Oh, that's really hard.
So I talk to them as well, and it's the same everywhere. It's just looks different sometimes, but it's all the same thing. We're all struggling to try and make it change.
Yeah, at the root, it's all the same. The pain, the loneliness, the disconnection that gets coped with in all sorts of kind of dysfunctional ways. So
absolutely.
It's find a way. They figure out a way to deal with their issues. Sometimes it's not very healthy. So, so. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing this wealth of knowledge with us. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wish I would have, or anything else you'd like to share?
I just wanted to share 2 resources with parents if they don't want to go the big picture, but they're going, my kid's struggling and I'm just listening to this amazing podcast that you're doing. And there's a really great website, a great resource that I know of that I recommend to a lot of parents if your kids are struggling with mental health. And it's basically cognitive behaviour therapy for kids done in animated YouTube clips. But it's called GoZen. I think her website's gozen.com.
Like GOZEN?
GOZEN, yep. And she's very well trained in psychology. Amazing. I used it with my son. I sat next to my son and learned from it myself.
Okay.
And I just literally told our school psychologist about it yesterday because it's a really incredible program. So I would highly recommend that just in case if someone's kid's struggling and you're like, but I need help now, I think it's a really good starting point. The other one, which is an Australian-based one, more for high school kids and sort of 12 to 25-year-olds, is called Reach Out. I recommend it to my son and I recommend it to teachers and parents. They've got it one spot where there's a forum where kids can go on and talk to other kids that are also struggling, but it's monitored by psychologists. It's really powerful, and you can go on there and go, my kid's struggling with body image. Great, well, this is some strategies. But a kid can go on and go, I'm struggling with body image. This is what I can do. Oh. So if you Google reachout.com.au, so just be aware it's got the .au for Australia, but anyone can access that. And I just have found that to be really useful.
Great. I'll put those links in the show notes. And also, it dawned on me to make sure everybody knew about, in the US, the new 988 number. Have you heard of this yet?
No, I haven't.
Okay. So everybody knows 911. And in the past, when you're feeling suicidal or have a mental health crisis, you call 911. Well, who comes to that? People with guns. Yeah. Not good. My son, for example, had dreamed of having suicide by cop, which is when you go after a cop's gun and then they kill you. So he thought that sounded like a really good idea at one point. So it's terrifying to me to call on the police when there's a mental health issue. Well, it's a national program. Instead of 911 for mental health, you call 988. And then you get social worker, therapist, mental health provider, and they will send out the appropriate team. But unless there's somebody like in imminent danger, there's going to be no one with a gun nearby. And they will direct you to resources and help you in that more specific way that we need help. So I think that's a really big step. Yeah.
That's really interesting because just a week ago in our news, I just saw that they're looking to introduce the same thing in Australia.
Oh, very good.
So that's amazing. So, and I've seen that same issue happen. We had a beautiful friend of mine, one of her kids was really struggling and just was in crisis, absolute crisis. Yeah. And the only option at the time was to ring 000, which is our number here. And she had to be taken to the hospital in a paddy wagon, which is like just horrendous. And the cops didn't want to do that, but they had zero options. And she was actually concerned for her safety. And I just think the detriment to the mental health, that you've got to get them so far up in crisis before they get to come back down,
Yes.
So,
Yeah. So there's hope there. I know there's lots of people working on these kinds of issues, and hopefully if we all put our heads together, we can help make it a little bit easier for everybody.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, this is important work, and thank you very much for sharing. I'm so glad to get to know somebody in Australia.
Yeah.
That's so cool. And thank you for being on board with Safe Home, and really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. And listeners, make sure to go find Renee's information. I'll put the links in the show notes. And also, while you're at it, go find Safe Home Podcast on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, all the places. We have a Patreon account if you'd like to donate a small amount every month to help us maintain this commercial-free podcast. Go to patreon.com/safehome. I want to give a big, huge thank you to 3 new Patreon members this week: Wendy Bancroft, Rachel Shedderly, and Kim Wistos Loudermilk. I'm so glad you 3 hopped on board. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you very much for listening. Please share this episode with someone you know that might work at a school or might be a community member that might want to be engaged in this kind of big picture work, and have them listen to this wonderful episode. Well, Renee and I want you all to
stay safe.